So Paul's answering by saying, well, this is all about understanding nature, and nature has its pluses and its minuses, its good points and its bad points, its gain and loss. And with regard to people, then nobody can avoid the process of change and decay. Even an act of spreading metta and developing friendship or doing good things, like gathering together for some kind of communal activity, comes to a point where everybody then has to separate off. And just like today, we come together and meet like this, at some point we're going to have to go our separate ways. So with regard to your mother, you just have to keep seeing it as nothing other than nature, and then the whole situation, the whole process will become normal, because nobody can refute or go against the laws of nature. Usually what we call ignorance or delusion, which we all experience, manifests in the form of desire, some kind of wanting things to be a certain way. And as a result, we're just constantly rejecting the truth of nature. So really, it's a universal experience. When Paul says, I myself was born with a mother and a father, I didn't come from somewhere else. And so seeing that this is simply the nature of existence and the nature of life, then the way to relate to our parents is to bring up the contemplation that these are people who have been of great benefit to us, and so now what we can do is do our duty, our role, which is to look after our parents as best we can, to make sure they're as comfortable as they are in these last stages of their life. But we can't actually prevent the nature from playing out. This is what we call Satya Dhamma, or ultimate truth, or the truth of the law of nature. Everything arises and then alters and fades and finally passes away completely or goes out. So if we understand this passage or this process, we just see it's happening all the time, like say the moon and the stars. In the morning it gets light and we say, oh, now this is the useful time, the time of the day, and it's kind of positive, but then morning turns to afternoon, evening and night time again. So accepting this, understanding this law of nature and seeing that everything, in fact, that we experience is an expression of this very truth, this truth of the law of change, and it's something that nobody can run away from. So as this understanding grows, in time we'll understand it just more and more. A really specific, skillful means of relating to a death or death of somebody, the aging process, is what's called maranasati. This is a meditation, contemplation, bringing up the awareness of death, contemplation of death. And so you bring this up as your object of contemplation, and when you do that, then the mind actually becomes free from agitation. This agitation and dis-ease or unstillness of mind is what we call a nivarana. It's a hindrance. It's an obstacle to meditation. So when you contemplate maranasati or death contemplation, you bring up the simple awareness that nobody knows when death will strike or when death will come, but what we do know is that we all must die, and that all the time there's people going through this process.
Yeah, I guess there's is it alright to add something?
Sure.
I think part of my problem is she's not accepting that she's dying, and there's a lot of physical and emotional suffering, and it's hard for me to kind of be there for her, but not completely become immersed in it. I'm trying to be as mindful as I can about it, but I'm trying to accept that maybe this is what she's doing and she needs to do it, but I'm not sure if there's something else I could do.
So with somebody, with people that we're very much bound up with, people that have had a lot to do with us in our life, then one thing we have to do, one of our responsibilities, is to what we call return the debt of gratitude. We have to acknowledge that we have a debt of gratitude to people and return it. And so again, the mother and father are people who, in Buddhism we say, are people who have been of great value or great use to us in our lives. And so as a result then, knowing this and understand this process of looking after a parent is one way that we ourselves can learn to grow in our spiritual practice. So we should bring on the constant contemplation. She looked after us, she looked after me so much. How can I now look after her? She worked for me, and now the roles reverse. It's time for me to carry on the job based on whatever she passes on to me. So whatever situation you find yourself in, now is the time to work with it. So you could call this experience just simply the world, or life. Old age is simply a truth that none of us can avoid. So our role right now, the role of a child, is to nurse or to care for an older person, care so that they experience a certain amount of ease. And it's a good thing to train, because now, for example, with old people there's often bodily suffering, and then the body begins to break down, and people caring for old people have to learn not to be adverse or to have problems with dealing with things like the body breaking down, difficulties passing, the process of the body defecating, urinating. These are things to have to face up to and take on. But then finally it reaches a point when the body finally breaks down, everyone passes away. Then as a child you can honor the memory of people who have passed on, developing spiritual qualities in yourself and bringing them to mind. We have traditions where you can do what's called making merit, which is to perhaps invite samanas. Samanas are monks or nuns, mendicants, religious people who are very free from greed, hatred and delusion, people whose minds are not unwholesome, and make an offering to them. And this is something which gives rise to much happiness, and that you can share with the memory of your mother. So these are ways in the more long term of dealing with it. But in the meantime, if your mother's still around in the last stages of her life, and she experiences physical pain and difficulties, then it's time for you to develop what we call patient endurance. Practice. You can try to and encourage her to develop patient endurance. If possible, then to encourage her to contemplate things or see things which lead to a kind of letting go rather than these strong attachments. But it's difficult because it's just difficult for people who aren't used to Dhamma practice, who are used to seeing things in the light of letting go. It's difficult. We just have this constant contemplation in the Dhamma that everything has to separate and pass on, the mind and the body. None of us here have any special rights or privileges over nature. We're all just returning to our original state. Earth, air, fire and water, the elements that make us up, we're all just part of this process of returning to nature. There's nothing left here that we own for ourselves. And so thinking like this a lot gives rise to a lot of acceptance. And then for oneself, one sees that in time, actually the aging process is something which, when we age and pass away, it's like we're finally able to put down a burden that we've been carrying for a long time, and peace of mind arises in its place. So this is the kind of contemplation that we train ourselves in, but it is very difficult for people, especially if they're trying to develop it late in life. So it needs a lot of patient endurance. This law of nature is something that we all experience. And Paul says, even myself sitting here for a long time now, if I sit for a long time, my leg begins to hurt. So this is just nature manifesting. It's like a reminder, reminding me that everything that arises passes away. But of course, it may well be that if we try to teach these kind of truths to people or encourage them to accept it, then they often reject them because it's just too much to take on with a mind that hasn't been training for a long time. But really, dukkha vedana, or physical, painful feelings, can communicate the truth of nature if we contemplate it properly. We can see emptiness, what this word emptiness, we can see it in our process by understanding suffering. We have a chant which we chant, which says, anicca vata sankhara, impermanent indeed are all conditioned phenomena. So everything that arises has to pass away. But again, it's difficult. It may well be that your mother's never really trained or been forced to think in this way. Very difficult concepts to take on. So in any case, it's something you can learn from. But death, this process of death, it's like an inheritance that we all receive. And it's an inheritance that no one can take away from us, or we just can't get rid of. And this is the heart of the Buddhist teaching. Everything in life, society, everything has to decay and separate as part of its intrinsic nature. Okay, Luang Por saying that this process of nature and old age, sickness and death really affects everybody, myself included. A long time ago I left the home and I left my parents to seek the shelter and refuge of the monk's robe, this yellow robe. But I always thought back to my parents and as I practiced, I encouraged them to think in a different way. I encouraged them to consider that they too might renounce society. At first they didn't want to because they were worried. My mother was worried about her family and material possessions and things to do with the world. So I told my mother, "You've been working for a long time, doing all these things out in the world. There's no end to it all. When will it ever end?" So talking to my mother in this way, finally she came to the monastery. It wasn't easy for her. It took a lot of time. She was very worried about people and the things in her life. So I compare it to like washing something dirty. If something's dirty, you can wash it and make it clean, but it takes a long time to scrub away at it. So in time then she understood. And so she said, "All right, yes, I'm now at peace with the world." And so she came to the monastery. Finally she died when she was 81 years old. And she was lucky she was able to look after herself for most of that time. But eventually her body, what we call the sankharas, just the conditioned process of mind and body, passed on in line with nature. I prepared and arranged for a coffin for her before she died. I attended to the details myself, and then I took my mother to come and see the coffin. I said, "Mother, this is how we're going to look after you." And she said, "That's no problem." She was okay with that. Finally, her kidneys began to fail, and the doctors and nurses looked after her, and there were medicines and chemicals that she could be treated with to help her with her kidneys and her urinary system, to stimulate her kidneys, but it was only a very temporary thing. One morning when she was very sick, I thought, well, I won't go on alms round. I'll better go and visit my mother because, she's somebody who was so good to me all this time. So I told the monks and novices that I wouldn't be going on alms round and going to the meal that day. And when I reached her, the moment when I reached her, her kidneys finally failed and she died. So it was just natural. There was nothing special about it, and I just dealt with it in the usual way that you have to deal with these situations. People often get worried when looking after parents that other people will criticize them, saying you didn't look after them well enough. The important thing is to bring all of these thoughts or contemplations bring it all back to yourself, so that you're preparing yourself for your own process. And as a result, thinking about death and the process of death ends or helps put an end to all this restless agitation and heat of the mind, the mind's heat and intoxication, the mind's ability to get lost in all kinds of things. And when you contemplate death, it leads you towards ending your own suffering. Whenever we get hot and bothered and agitated, it's simply the result of us rejecting the truth of the law of nature. It's what we call micchaditthi, which means wrong view. Whenever the mind's hot and bothered, there's no happiness there, there's no ease. So we should just understand that this process of nature is simply that, just nature. No one has any special rights or privileges or ownership over themselves, over their body. It's just all ultimate reality. Really, there's nothing there. And when you can contemplate this way, the mind is peaceful. The heat goes out, the intoxication ends, and the suffering is extinguished. And this is what leads to freedom. So we can use all of these difficult situations and contemplations to improve and to develop our own views, realizing that nature is just something we can't prevent. We can use this contemplation to train ourselves to abandon desire, and also be very careful with regard to what we call the loka dhammas, the worldly conditions, things like praise and blame. Because praise is something which we experience in life, and if we're not careful, then praise can make us lose ourselves. We can get lost in it. Anything, in fact, that pleases us or that we like can delude us. And so we train ourselves, rather than seeing the world as something desirable and always trying to get things the way we want. Just the contemplation that something like just seeing the body, seeing that the body is not intrinsically pure and beautiful and clean, this can really help keep away suffering. And Paul was adding that year when his mother died, it was quite difficult. He didn't have a car, so he borrowed. Was it his mother in hospital at the time? Yeah. What Paul?
It was maybe right after she died, and we were helping with
Just before, Luang Por was saying that not only his mother came to ordain at that time, but also his younger sister. But it was a little bit difficult because his father wanted his younger sister to get married, and he'd actually already promised her to another man in the village. And so in the traditions of the village there, when his daughter declined to get married and decided to ordain as a nun instead, his father had to pay compensation to the prospective fiancé's family. So there's a bit of an issue. At the end then, Luang Por just said this: death is what we call a deva duta. It's usually translated as a heavenly messenger. You know, the famous story that Buddha's, in the legend, he saw an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a monk. So these are called the heavenly messengers. Luang Por just translated it slightly differently. He said, Pubok. It's like the supreme newscaster, the supreme announcer of news. That's to say that death, old age, sickness, and death. At first, they're a sight that you see and you get some understanding, but then it's what will manifest in your own life as well. It's really when you see somebody who's dying, you're really getting news about the truth of your own experience, not them. So that's why it's the supreme newscast.
That his mother ordained was 15 years.
That's right. So even the Buddha as well, if you read the life history of the Buddha, he gave great importance to his parents, and the Buddha's father, when he was old and at the end of his life, the Buddha went to see him and taught him the Dhamma, and it was a way that the Buddha could look after him and nurse him. Some people get the idea that when you ordain or become a monk, that you cut off all your ties to your family and just take care of yourself, or you're just only concerned with your own welfare or your own success. But that's not how it is at all. This recollecting the Buddha is a good meditation object. It's called Buddhanusati, recollecting the Buddha or recollecting the qualities of the Buddha. It's one of the meditation objects which is called an araka kammatthana, something meditation object which helps look after oneself when you develop it. It's like a protection to yourself. And the first one is Buddhanusati, recollecting the qualities of the Buddha, thinking that of somebody who developed constant metta, loving kindness, and who was seeking the highest happiness. When you contemplate properly Buddhanusati, it helps abandon one's sense of self, because you see that there's nothing within you, in your mind and body, that is permanent, that is stable. It's an essence which you could say you own, nothing that is you, nothing that is yours. And as a result, your mind will incline towards letting go. It will feel light and at ease and clean and pure.
Time to go there just for food.